Well, good evening, everybody. If you happen to be joining us live for Wednesday night Bible study as we continue to make our way through the Gospel of John. Yes, we have made it literally 1 year now in the Gospel of John. This is week number 52 of our study, kind of diving a little deeper into the Gospel of John, and we are in John chapter 18. So not too much longer to go, down to 3 chapters after this. But if you're joining us tonight and you've been joining regularly, you probably already know that if you go to the main page of our website, BloomsburgChristianChurch.com, you will be able to get a copy of the PDF that we use in order to follow along tonight. And if you don't have that PDF with you, that's no worries. I'm going to try and talk my way through that in a way that still describes exactly what's going on that outline. And give you some idea what's happening there. But if you aren't familiar with that and you're joining us for the first time tonight, please don't hesitate to go there to get that. And you'll find there's some fill-in-the-blanks that are part of that. We'll go ahead and fill those in as we're going along. Not too many, but just something to kind of give some folks something to do, fill them in ahead of time to see how many you get correct, and something to just kind of keep attention locked in as we're making our way through. So if all goes well tonight, we're going to go through all of John chapter 18. Handout's a little long, but I think based on the way we're going to go through it, we should be able to make it tonight. We usually try and go about 1 hour. Last week I went a couple minutes over, so I'll try not to go too far beyond my time tonight. So let's go ahead and get rolling. So just some context, first of all. Contextually, what's going on is Jesus has had that last meal with his closest followers that we refer to as the Last Supper. In John, in chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, John tells us a variety of things about what goes on at that meal that the other Gospels do not. And that doesn't mean that proves they're all out of joint, that they contradict each other. It's just that John chooses to focus on some things that the other Gospel writers didn't. And please remember, John writes his Gospel a number of years after the other three have already written theirs. And his target audience primarily are Greeks that are coming to faith in Jesus Christ. Probably about 1,000 Greeks for every one Jew at this point that's coming to Christ. Significant time has gone on, although we're still in the first century, not a super long amount of time. I know people begin to say, well, my goodness, if that was written 20, 30 years after Jesus actually lived, how could it be right? Please keep in mind that if you're a student of history right now, or my goodness, even of basic history, there's somebody, for example, named Alexander the Great that you study about in history. And everything we know about Alexander the Great comes from manuscripts about his life that are about 800 years after he actually lived, that they were written. So this idea of the Gospels being a few decades after Jesus lived and us questioning whether they're accurate or not, if you threw those out, you'd probably have to throw out most of history, especially when you get into the manuscripts we have to show that they were copied in a proper way as they were passed along, and other information we have about particularly the New Testament. You'd be getting rid of a lot of history if you got rid of some of the books there, including the Gospel of John. So Jesus is continuing to unpack some of this information, and as we get into this chapter, we're going to see some information shared that is similar to what goes on in the other Gospels, although there is still just a little bit that's different. So John chapter 18, I'm going to read verses 1 through 14 in order to begin. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. Now remember, Jesus in John chapter 17 just makes that great priestly prayer where he prays to his Father for his believers then and for us today as followers of Jesus Christ. And if you weren't with us last week, you can literally go and check that out where Jesus, he prays for you as a follower of his way back when. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. So let's go back to verse 1 and just kind of share a couple things here. You'll notice on the very bottom of page 1 on the outline, if you're following along, it says, "This verse seems pretty factual and not packed with any additional meaning. But there is one particular detail related to the geography involved that is pretty profound." And then I have any thoughts. So let me read that one verse for you, just in case you don't have an outline in front of you. Here's what it said. "When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley." That's it. So they left the area of the upper room where they were having that Last Supper meal, and they crossed over the Kidron Valley to get to the Mount of Olives where the Garden of Gethsemane is. If you notice on the top of page 2, there is something particular about what's going on here that a lot of scholars point out. On the top of page 2, you'll see I have a basic diagram of Jerusalem at that time, and you'll notice that up near the upper right center is the temple complex. If you see that temple complex, you'll notice that right across from that on the right, there is an arrow pointing at Gethsemane. That's where the Garden of Gethsemane that they're going to is. You'll notice if you look all the way down in the very left corner, that's typically the location of the upper room, traditionally where they had the last meal. So you may notice there's some ground to cover, but if you do it by scale, it's not, it kind of looks like they're walking miles and miles and miles to get from point A to point B there, but it's really not that far. But if you look on that diagram, you'll notice there's one other arrow down below from Gethsemane, and it's pointing to that very thin line that runs by the words Kidron Valley. That is the Kidron Brook. And here's the interesting thing. It says underneath that diagram, in the Kidron Valley, there was a small stream that carried the drainage from the temple. So here's the temple complex up on the hill, if you saw actual replications of what existed at that time. And of course, some of the remnants are still there today. Temple complex is up on the hill. We go down into the valley where this stream is in the Kidron Valley. And then as you're coming up the other side, now we're going to the Garden of Gethsemane. So from the temple, there was kind of this discharge canal that went down into that stream. Now, if you know anything about what's going on in that temple complex usually, you know that they're sacrificing all kind of animals continuously. And all the blood of those animals is going somewhere. In particular, at this time, they're in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, one of the 3 feasts that Jewish males were required if they were within 15 miles to come back to Jerusalem for. So you've got thousands, if not tens and hundreds of thousands of people, in addition to those already there, coming back for the Feast of Passover. And over the next day or two, the estimates are that there'll be up to 250,000 lambs that are going to be sacrificed. So think of the blood associated with that. And all of that's getting discharged down that canal into the stream to be carried away. So it goes on and says this. This stream was most likely literally red in color due to the sacrifices constantly being made at the temple. And then William Barclay, one of the folks that I look at when I research these studies, says this. From the altar there was a channel down to the brook Kedron, and through that channel the blood of the Passover lambs drained away. When Jesus crossed the brook Kedron, it would still be red with the blood of the lambs which had been sacrificed. And then Charles Spurgeon adds this. The very brook would remind him of his approaching sacrifice, for through it flowed the blood and refuse from the temple. So you've got the once-for-all sacrificial lamb, so to speak, Jesus Christ, who all the Passover points toward. And he's crossing this stream that is running red with the blood of the sacrificial lambs that are all temporary sacrifices. Remember, that whole system, that temple complex, the priesthood, the sacrifices, literally all of that, and we've spoken about that in the past, that's literally all just a picture of Jesus. He's the reality of all that, the great high priest, the once-for-all sacrifice, the one who will put his life, so to speak, on the altar. It all points to him, and it's kind of interesting to think that, although it's somewhat of a morbid moment, obviously, given what's going to happen with Jesus, that here he is crossing that stream, the reality of the one true sacrifice, while the blood of all those other sacrifices run right underneath his feet. If we go on to verse 2, just a reminder of what it said. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So just to give you a little bit of background that's not on the outline, when they lived in Jerusalem at that time, you really couldn't create garden plots in Jerusalem. Now, wealthy folks, they had gardens, but they had to purchase space up on the Mount of Olives. There were all kind of rituals and rites they had where ground was sacred. So I know for those of you that may have gardens in your backyard, or you've got a big garden that you care for this time of year each year, that had to be over on the Mount of Olives. And most likely what it's thought is that somebody gave Jesus and his followers the key to their plot so they could get in and spend time regularly in the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, you and I, we only hear Garden of Gethsemane when it comes to this time, not long before Jesus is going to be arrested and executed. But it seems to be, from what's shared here, based on the fact that Judas kind of knows where they're going to be, that they probably went there fairly regularly, and that it was a place they typically found their way to, most likely led in by somebody who was wealthy to use their plot, so to speak. On page 2 of the outline, it says this under verse 2. John doesn't say it is the Garden of Gethsemane. He just says the garden. But the other gospel writers do say the Garden of Gethsemane. Given Judas's familiarity with its location and his desire not to remain hidden anymore, Jesus most likely went to a place Judas would be likely to look. In other words, Jesus didn't say before they left that upper room where they were headed. But remember, Judas left to go betray him. But Jesus went to a place, it seems, most scholars think, that he knew Judas would know to look. Because now his time has come. He's not trying to flee those who are seeking to take his life. No, now it's time for his life to be taken. So he's not hiding anymore. It goes on and says this. In Hebrew, Gethsemane, that word means olive press. And what an olive press was a place of crushing, which is an apt description of what Jesus would experience here as the weight of what awaited him came upon him. Remember, we said that John doesn't necessarily say everything the other gospel writers do, and they don't necessarily say everything John does. And one of the things that John doesn't get into is when Jesus is in the garden praying. Father, if this cup can be taken from me, if there's any way, that'd be great, but not my will, thy will be done. Remember, he prays that 3 different times, and if you remember the movie The Passion of the Christ, at the very beginning, they try and recreate that, taking a little liberty of even having the character portraying Satan himself present there, and actually even having the book of Genesis come into play when, if you remember the movie, Jesus is on the ground, he's sweating droplets of blood, and all of a sudden a snake slithers up, and Jesus regains his composure and slams on the snake's head. And of course, that's a reference back to Genesis, that the serpent would strike the heel of the woman's offspring, yet he would crush the serpent's head. And we've covered that, I think, at some other point. I don't know if we did it in this study, but when we talk about the earliest occurrence of the gospel, believe it or not, most folks think it's right there, right in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. That it's actually called the Proto-Evangelion, the earliest good news, sought to represent Jesus crushing the head of Satan, his adversary, which he would literally do through what he's about to do. If you look on the top of page 3 of the outline, and I'm sorry if you printed it out in black and white, it kind of loses some of what it was trying to get across. That's actually literally a picture of the Garden of Gethsemane today. And if you notice those olive trees that are there, man, they're huge. I mean, they're really big. And some of those are thought to go back centuries. I don't know if they make it all the way to Jesus' time, but if you have that picture in color, it's amazing to see, because it's literally, I mean, if you Google Garden of Gethsemane, you'll see a picture like that. It's just amazing to see what that place looked like. I remember years ago when I would hear about the Garden of Gethsemane, I'd think of these like little shrubs you had planted that like were going to grow in a tree someday by your house, and Jesus may be praying on a rock, and there are a couple little plants. No, these trees were trees, and it's just amazing to see the beauty of that area he was in at such a hard time, and what a juxtaposition that must have been, the beauty and yet the tragedy that was going to be going on in a human sense with him being arrested, tortured, and executed. Speaks about verse 3 next, and just to remind you of verse 3, so Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Let's deal with the very last sentence, because I don't think I got into that on the outline. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons, which traditionally, based on warfare of that day, meant they were thinking there was going to be violence and a fight. That Jesus maybe was going to go, they're going to have to find him in a cave or something. He was going to go try and hide himself. And there were going to be weapons needed, that it was going to be an all-out rebellion where they were going to be fighting each other. But notice the first part of that. It includes a detail that in Greek we probably don't get when we look at the English. I know I never did until I saw the Greek. If you look on page 3 underneath that picture of the Garden of Gethsemane, here's what it says. John doesn't get into what Jesus prayed while here, but he does share that Judas was accompanied by both the temple police, so to speak, and Roman soldiers. Remember, Rome is ultimately in charge. Rome is in charge, but Israel is part of the Roman Empire. So there are Roman soldiers that are ultimately in authority. But there's still in Israel the temple with the Pharisees and the Sadducees that make up the Sanhedrin, the governing authority, and they have their own police force, so to speak. If you ever see pictures of what's going on in the Garden of Gethsemane when the soldiers show up, if it's true to that time, you'll see soldiers that look like Roman soldiers that you're used to seeing, kind of the guys that look like they have the red scrubbing brushes up on their head because of the helmets they wore, and the red and the armor. But you'll see these other guys that have these helmets, they almost look like leather helmets with flaps that hang down. And that's actually the police force of the Sanhedrin. So we've got the Jewish police and the Roman authorities showing up together. And what we often miss is how many of them there were. Based on the word used to describe the cohort of soldiers that were present, the smallest number of Roman soldiers, picture this. I mean, think about what you've always pictured of Jesus in the garden. Here's Judas and some guys. The smallest number this word typically would represent in Greek is 200 soldiers. The other options are 600 and 1,000. So here's Jesus and his 11 guys, and hundreds of soldiers show up from the Roman army, plus the guys from the Sanhedrin, and of course Judas. David Guzik says this: a sinless man in an appointed garden was about to do battle with Satan's representative. The first time this happened, with Adam, the sinless man failed. The second Adam would not fail. Man, that's a powerful statement. Once again, echoing back to the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve were there. And here's the serpent showing up, trying to convince them to take of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And at that point, Adam and Eve are sinless until they do other than God desires. And that Adam fails. But this Adam will not in this garden. Then verses 4 through 9, just to remind you, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," and think of this now, a couple hundred soldiers, they drew back and fell to the ground when Jesus says, "I am he." Again, he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one that you have given me." So if we go back to page 3 of the outline, it is thought that one of the reasons Jesus asks who they are seeking is to seek to prevent violence against the others with him. I never really picked up on that myself, but several of the folks I read said that no, it's not that Jesus purposely says that in order to kind of take the other guys out of the mix. Hey, it's me you're looking for, not these guys. And it seems to play out based on what he says coming after that he's kind of looking to protect these guys a little bit. When they respond, Jesus of Nazareth, and then Jesus responds, might there be an additional meaning in his words? Now, here's the thing. In English, they say they're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. And Jesus, what it's written there in our English Bibles, it says, Jesus says, "I am he." Only here's the thing. In Greek, it doesn't say he. Jesus just simply says, "I am." Ego eimi. And I think if we just stop there and you thought for a moment, you've heard those words and God kind of combined before. Exodus chapter 3, Moses shows up at this burning bush. "I'm sending you back. You're going to be my representative to rescue my people out of bondage in Egypt." And here's part of what it says. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. 'I am has sent me to you.'" And of course, that's where we get what's called the Tetragrammaton, YHWH. Later, some vowels are added, so we call it, we pronounce it Yahweh. It's more like Yahweh, Haveh. But it's the word I am. Ego eimi. Top of page 4, David Guzik says this: Jesus answered them with this curious phrase, 2 words in both English and in the original language, ego eimi. It is curious because Jesus didn't say, "I am he," but simply, "I am." The he was added by the translators and is not in the original text. With this, Jesus consciously proclaimed that he was God, connecting his words to the many previous I am statements, even recorded in the Gospel of John. And I know I kind of went back 10 chapters to John chapter 8 there, but just to remind you, one other time when Jesus does that, John chapter 8, verses 56 through 59. Jesus is speaking, and he says this, "Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. You are not yet 50 years old," they said to him, "and you have seen Abraham?" "Very truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "before Abraham was born, I am." And notice what happened next. They knew exactly what he was doing. Notice what it says. At this they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. They picked up the stones to stone him because they were accusing him of blasphemy. He was saying he was equal with God. Before Abraham was born, I am. So, what follows next on page 4 says this, whether it was the authority of his words when Jesus says, I am, or their possible meaning, the posture of those there to arrest Jesus takes a dramatic turn. These are professional soldiers. And it says, Jesus says, I am, and they all shrink back and fall to the ground. Some believe this results in the statement to let those with him go being said with authority, with Jesus seeking to make it clear that he will come willingly if no harm comes to the others. Here's what happens. Jesus says, I am. They shrink back. Again, he asks them, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth. And he answers, I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, then let these men go. And some people think that based on them realizing the equation he's making here, making himself equal with God, or just even the authority in his voice, that Jesus isn't so much striking this tone, so please let these guys go. It's more like this, no, I'm him, therefore let these guys go. I'll come, they go. And he's doing it with authority. And he's doing it to be sure that no harm comes to the others with him. Verses 10 through 12, then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus, and they bound him. So I don't have a whole lot written there for this, but here's what it says, bottom of page 4. And there's some illustrations. And again, I know we don't have actual pictures of Jesus. Those illustrations just kind of depict a pretty accurate representation of what was going on. It says this for verses 10 through 12. Peter's action would more than likely result in harm being done to him and the other apostles, and it wouldn't help Jesus at all. We got several hundred soldiers there. Peter grabs a sword, strikes this guy's ear. Jesus just got done saying, hey, I'll come, let these guys go. Peter is not going to overcome this force and help Jesus. But he may harm his own cause where Jesus is saying, let these guys go. So it's not really doing any good for him to do this at all at this point. Jesus knows that the time has come for his mission to be completed. Notice what he says when Peter does this. Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Now, John doesn't record the words, but remember what Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. We just mentioned it not too long ago. Father, if this cup can be taken from me, that'd be great. But not my will be done, your will be done. And the cup is not necessarily the physical pain on the cross. The cup is thought to be the fact that when Jesus has our sin and God's justice against that sin placed upon himself, that even if it's momentary, there's going to be this separation between he and God, because God cannot even look upon him at that point. And Jesus is not looking forward to that at all. Yeah, the other stuff's going to hurt, but it's that They've been eternally in relationship. And that's going to be severed, even if just for a moment. And it's not that's the cup Jesus is speaking about, not so much the physical pain. But what Peter's doing is nothing good is going to come of it. And Jesus kind of shuts it down pretty quick. And then he actually puts the guy's ear back on. Finishes that portion that we read saying this: they bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. So they get Jesus. Now, if Caiaphas is the high priest, that kind of puts him in charge of the Sanhedrin. So why would they take him to Annas? He doesn't seem to have any position. Well, at the top of page 5, it says this: Annas was the power behind the throne in Jerusalem. He himself had been high priest from AD 6 to 15. 4 of his sons had also held the high priesthood, and Caiaphas was his son-in-law. So Annas is like the guy behind the scenes who's got like the real power. Like sometimes we see in politics today, the candidate, he's kind of getting his strings pulled by somebody else, and it's the one behind the scenes that's got the power. And so really it seems like Annas has some authority. They go to him first. But remember then, they take him to Caiaphas, and Caiaphas had at one point said that it would be good if one man died for the people. And if you look in John chapter 11, going backwards again, here's a little more detail of what is said. If we let him, meaning Jesus, go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. These are the Jewish leaders, religious leaders speaking. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So, first thing that's clear here, Jesus doesn't have much of a chance to get any kind of fair hearing in front of these guys. They've already marked him in the past, like, it's better this one guy die. So the chance of a fair hearing, that's not really going to go on here. But in addition to that, notice what happens. Caiaphas literally prophesies what God is going to use for good, even though he doesn't mean it that way. He's out to get Jesus. Oh yeah, it's so much better if one guy dies for the whole nation than the whole nation suffer. So he's kind of setting it up for Jesus to be, kind of blackballed and blacklisted. But God is going to use those exact words just to lend veracity to what Jesus is about to do, because he is going to die. And not just for that nation, but for all of mankind. So that was that first section, verses 1 through 14 in John chapter 18. Now, if you're on page 5, you'll notice it picks up next with verses 15 through 18. And here's what it says. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Remember, now they have him in custody. They're taking him back to Annas. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. So notice what's going on here. Jesus is being taken in custody. Peter is kind of following along, but there's another disciple there. And the high priest's family know him. So much so that they let him in the courtyard while Peter's got to wait outside. Hey, you can come. No, you have to wait. We don't know you. Goes on and says this. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing there with them, warming himself. So notice what's going on. There's this other one of the 11 that's with Peter, and here's the thing, bottom of page 5, that's thought to be John. Remember John when he writes at one point, he says, oh, and the disciple Jesus loved leaned on his bosom. He never really comes out and says, it was me. He kind of just refers to this generic individual, but he means him. And it's thought once again that he's doing that here, that it's John who's with Peter. And they know John, so they let him into the courtyard with Jesus. They even know he's a follower of Jesus's. Remember what the servant girl? Hey, you're not a follower of his also, she says to Peter, which even lends more credence that she knows that John is a follower of his. Now, of course, Peter replies, I am not. So the disciple with Peter is thought to be John, and it appears he and or his family had some type of relationship with the high priest's family. He gets to go into the courtyard, and they seem to know that he's a disciple of Jesus already. So if you look on the top of the next page, I have a little, obviously there's been all kind of paintings and illustrations of Peter when he's gathered around this fire. And once again, we don't have photographs from back then, so we don't know exactly what it looked like. But if you look at that picture I have there, Peter is represented by the guy who's all the way squatted down. And here's the interesting thing in that picture. Peter in that picture, he's got gray hair, gray beard. I mean, if I asked you to guess how old he was, you'd say he's kind of up there. But here's the interesting thing. Based on what we know about Jesus' followers, you could probably make a pretty good case, although we really can't verify it, that the 12 apostles, the guys that we see as responsible for spreading the gospel, of course Judas was ultimately replaced, that those 12 guys, when Jesus first calls them, you can make a pretty good case. They were teenagers. And here's why I say that. Peter most likely was the oldest, because at one point during his ministry, Jesus tells Peter to go and retrieve a fish out of the water, and inside he will find a temple tax amount that will cover him and Jesus. He'll find the money for the temple tax that he and Jesus have to pay, but it's only he and Jesus. Well, at that point, the temple tax had to be paid by anybody over age 20. But it doesn't say anything about the other 11 guys. No temple tax for them. In addition to that, most rabbis, they called people to follow them. Their disciples, the Hebrew word talmudim, they called their talmudim once they completed what we would probably call, like, I don't know, 8th, 9th grade, around that age. At that point, they would find the brightest of the brightest, and they would call them to follow them. The rabbi would call them, but boy, they'd be kind of looking to find a rabbi to follow. That was like the big deal in society. Rabbis were the rock stars. And believe it or not, and we've mentioned this on other occasions, those individuals the rabbi typically picked, some of them, the brightest of the brightest, they had what we call the Old Testament memorized. Not the book of Genesis or the book of Malachi. Genesis to Malachi, memorized. Because that's what they spent all their time learning, God's Word. And again, often then it was mostly orally passed on. It wasn't written. You may have a synagogue, if they were lucky, they had a scroll that had part of the Hebrew Scriptures. They didn't like roll out Genesis to Malachi. Maybe they had something from the book of Isaiah or whatnot in the different communities. So, interesting thing, not only that they're teenagers, but to use our phraseology from the day, and it's not original with me, the 12 guys following Jesus, they're also like the JV. They're the B team. Remember when Jesus goes and finds them fishing with their dad, fishing on their own, tax collector? Kind of looks like no rabbi called them to follow him. They're back working with the family. Most likely not the brightest of the brightest. But Jesus calls them. And these 12 guys who very well may have been in their late teen years turn the world upside down on his behalf. Now, one thing that also occurs in this passage, and it's one of those areas I'm only going to point out because often people try and find these little loopholes to say, oh, there it is, can't trust the Bible, contradicts itself. And it's true, there's a difference here. Let me point out what I mean if you look underneath the picture. Luke and Matthew say that Peter and those around the fire were all sitting. Isn't that a pretty obvious contradiction? Because John just wrote they were all standing. One says sitting, well, two say sitting. One says standing. And it's one of those places right away, people, there it is. Can't trust it. I'd like to read something to you from Richard Trench and just ask you to once again remember that the Bible originally was not written in English. Old Testament written in Hebrew originally, New Testament written in Greek originally. And Richard Trench, a theologian, says this: Luke is quite definite that they and Peter were sitting. So too Matthew as to Peter. John seems to speak of them and Peter as standing. But these words used by John are so frequently idiomatic to mean merely to be stationary, to continue, to be there, to be, that the standing cannot be pressed. No more here than, for example, in the other 19 places where they occur in John's gospel. In other words, John is saying something, and he's not necessarily even meaning what he's saying. Oh, yeah, they were standing. To John, meaning they were in one place. Maybe they weren't even literally standing, but no, I mean they were in one place. And you and I, we can use language like that at times as well. And it's not when you look at the way John uses this phrase for standing in his other writing in the Gospel of John, it uses it in a number of ways where clearly we can't necessarily take it that, okay, they were literally standing. He may mean they were just stationary. And so it's not necessarily any contradiction at all. And believe it or not, when you find things like that in Scripture, a large part of the time, you can pretty quickly kind of unpack or untangle something that looks like it might be, aha, that's a contradiction. You just need to spend a little time looking at a variety of things, most likely a bunch of smart folks in the past that have really spent the time doing this. But just point that out because it comes up sometimes based on that particular part of the passage. So that takes us to verse 19. Meanwhile, so Peter, John, everybody at the fire warming themselves. Peter has denied Jesus once, but they took Jesus into Annas. So they're kind of in the same place, but Jesus is with Annas there at the fire. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. It's the very bottom of page 6. Notice that Jesus once again seems to protect his disciples by offering nothing about them. Right off the bat, high priest questioned Jesus about his teaching and his disciples. Jesus kind of addresses the teaching. Well, hey, I taught out plainly. He doesn't say a thing about his disciples. So once again, it seems like, in a way, he's protecting them. He's offering nothing about them. In addition, he makes clear that he has no hidden teaching. He has been plain and public about everything he has shared. So the idea that there's this big hidden teaching that Jesus has somewhere that somebody has unpacked or unlocked or found, don't buy it or believe it. Jesus says, look, everything I've done, public knowledge. It's interesting when he says, hey, why don't you go ask the people who heard? Top of page 7. Typically, in a legitimate trial, witnesses would be called first to testify to what they had seen and heard, not the accused. This was their own way to do a trial. And some of you may already know that when all this is going on, one of the things that happens is Jesus is on several different occasions with the Sanhedrin, with Pilate, with Herod. He's kind of put in this trial-like atmosphere, but like the rules are out the window. And it almost seems like he's trying to remind him here, hey, there's a way you typically do this. It's not this way. This wasn't the only way the Jewish authorities were violating their own law in regard to Jesus. Listen to this from a theologian named Adam Clark. For the Talmud states in a certain part of its writings, and the outline of where that is there, criminal processes can neither commence nor terminate, but during the course of the day. If the person be acquitted, the sentence may be pronounced during that day. But if he be condemned, the sentence cannot be pronounced till the next day. But no kind of judgment is to be executed either on the eve of the Sabbath or the eve of any festival, which is exactly what's going on here. They're contradicting their own law in dealing with Jesus. Now, finally, I have written there the physical abuse. Remember, the guard slaps Jesus. Finally, the physical abuse, which begins here with a slap, violated their laws as well. The law said you can't, somebody stands accused, you just can't start beating them around or kicking them around. They have to have a trial, and that trial has rules. All that's going out the window. Now, you notice underneath that, if you have some music knowledge from the last decade or so, that there's a picture there of a singer, and you may not be able to make out it's her. She's got a winter hat on, named Alanis Morissette. And she had a song once where she sang, I forget the whole song, but it was, "Isn't it ironic?" And that was like the key line, isn't it ironic? Isn't it ironic that the Jews are violating their law that they profess to uphold to honor God? They're violating it with God. Here's God in the flesh. And they're violating their law all over the place, dealing with God. Chapter 18 goes on. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself by the fire. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. Now, that's pretty straightforward, and we've talked about Peter's denial already. So let's just read one more verse, verse 28. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now, it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So, here we are, off to Pilate. So, on the top of page 8, you may notice that there's a picture there of what's called the Fortress Antonia. If you remember the big temple complex in Jerusalem, and notice I kind of blew up the picture into that. If you look up, Solomon's Temple, you'll see this part of it off to the side in the reconstructions. So this is where Pilate or the Roman authorities stayed when they were in Jerusalem. They weren't necessarily typically there all the time, but when they were there, this is where they stayed. And it's right off the one corner of the temple complex. And it was called the Fortress Antonia, or in your translation of Scripture, it also may be called the Praetorium. But that's where Pilate was when he was there. So, interesting. How do we see the glaring hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders here? They want to avoid becoming unclean by stepping in Fortress Antonia. No, we're not going in there. That'll make us unclean. So they're trying to follow this small portion of the law, while at the same time they're violating a huge portion of the law with the way they're handling Jesus, God himself. The hypocrisy is, for the people early on reading this, They would have been dumbfounded by the hypocrisy of this. Now, there is a question, though, and this may be new for you, but we stated this, I think we probably stated this like 49 weeks ago at this point, that this would come up at some point. Notice what it says. Let me just read this little bit, verse 28 again, and see if you catch anything. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Jesus eats with his closest followers. They go to the Garden of Gethsemane, nighttime, taken into custody, brought to another trial now in Rome before Pilate next morning. But now it says that the Jewish guys, the leaders, didn't want to go into the praetorium because they wanted to eat the Passover that night. So was Jesus' meal the night before actually a Passover meal? I mean, we call it the Last Supper and say he took the Passover and kind of pointed it back to him, rightfully so. But it seems to be pretty clear that something went on Thursday before we got to Friday. And Passover obviously starts Friday night at sundown. But we're not there yet. David Guzik says this. This statement introduces a controversy, namely this. Was the Last Supper a Passover meal? And was Jesus crucified on the Passover or the day following the Passover? This statement seems to indicate that the Passover was the coming day, the day Jesus would be crucified, and that the Last Supper was the day before Passover. Yet, several passages seem to indicate that the Last Supper was a Passover meal, and those passages are listed there. The best solution to this difficult chronological problem seems to be that Jesus was crucified on the Passover, and the meal they had the night before was a Passover meal. Held after sunset, the start of the day in Jewish reckoning. Remember, Jewish time, night to day, not morning to night, night to morning. Remember Genesis? God does such and such, and then there was evening and morning the first day. It's backwards from how we typically count it. So the Passover meal Jesus had with his followers even on Thursday night, technically it would have been on Passover because it would have happened after the sun went down, and we're technically on that Passover day. We can speculate that Passover lambs were sacrificed on both days, a necessity due to the massive number of lambs sacrificed in Jerusalem at the temple on Passover, later described by Josephus, Greek historian, to be more than 200,000 lambs. We mentioned that earlier when we were talking about the blood in that channel. Think about that for a moment. You got the priests in the temple at the altar. They have 250,000 lambs to sacrifice. That is going to take some time. So they actually think that literally it did start on that night when it was technically Passover on Thursday in the evening versus just starting on Friday. Because you've got 250,000 lambs to sacrifice. So let's go on. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. By all accounts, I'm on the top of page 9. By all accounts, Pilate was a cruel and brutal individual in his role as procurator. If you look at the history about Pilate, what we know about him, one cruel dude that didn't really care much about people. However, interestingly enough, here he seems to be more interested in the legitimacy of what is happening with Jesus than the Jewish leaders are. He asks to be told the charges against him. "Hey, here's this guy. We brought him for you to kill." What you would typically think of Pilate would be, okay, well, let's kill him. But he says, what are the charges against him? the Jews evade the question. Well, if he weren't guilty, we wouldn't bring him here. They don't answer the question. They evade it, seemingly seeking to have Pilate execute the sentence they already had decided. It's almost like, no, we decided what should happen. We just need you to do it. Although Rome is ultimately in charge. That's not really the way it works. But it's interesting because Pilate kind of backs up for a moment. Goes on and says this on page 9 in the outline. Interestingly enough, if the Jews had put Jesus to death according to their law, if they had taken him back like Pilate said, and hey, we find you guilty, and they put him to death according to their law, it would have been death by stoning, not by crucifixion. By asking the Romans to kill him, crucifixion comes into play, and thereby the fulfillment of Jesus' own words in John chapter 3. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. So, as you're watching what's going on here, notice all these prophecies and words of Jesus are being fulfilled by guys they don't even know they're doing it by what they're doing. And yet one after another is being fulfilled in Jesus. So, last part of John chapter 18. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you've done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now, my kingdom is from another place." "Oh, you are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. Now just something historical right off the bat here, bottom of page 9, last thing there. Here John seems to skip past Pilate's first meeting with Jesus and then Jesus' meeting with Herod. When you look at the other Gospels, Jesus shows up with Pilate, Pilate sends him to Herod, then he comes back to Pilate. Seems like John just kind of skips over the first two. Now we're back to his final time with Pilate in this final meeting. In verse 36, it says this. That's when Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." And there's a theologian named Merrill Tenney who says this about that passage. Augustine observed from this verse that earthly kingdoms are based upon force, pride, the love of human praise, the desire for domination, and self-interest, all displayed by Pilate and the Roman Empire. The heavenly kingdom, exemplified by Jesus and the cross, is based on love, sacrifice, humility, and righteousness, and is to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Gentiles foolishness. The obvious inference from his words would be that he came into the world from another realm, that whoever did not listen to him would not be characterized by truth, and that if Pilate really wanted to know what truth was, he would give Jesus his earnest attention. And of course, there's just an illustration there to show that big question Pilate asks that is critical for every one of us. What is truth? Now, it's interesting because in the writing, in what we have, when Pilate asks it, he asks it and doesn't even stick around for the answer. He's like off to do something else. And underneath those illustrations, notice what it says. It's thought that Pilate cuts off the conversation regarding truth so quickly because he has the information he needs in his governmental role. He knows what Jesus is accused of, what he's saying for himself. He's let Jesus speak, how big a threat he is, and whether or not he deserves punishment. In other words, he's got what he needs in terms of a pragmatic sense. He's not interested in a philosophical conversation about truth. Bummer for him, because that's the part he really should have focused on. Same with you and I. It says underneath there, unfortunately today, many cut off discussion of this question when it comes to Jesus because they think they have what they need as well, their own truth. And because we each think we have our own truth, and it's our truth that counts, and your truth is good for you, and my truth is good for me, and we're all okay as long as we have our own truth, we don't stop to pay attention to Jesus saying, the truth is found in him. Remember a couple chapters ago? No, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. So final thing, you may notice as we went along tonight, I didn't ask any application questions as we were going, because in many ways what we talked about was fairly straightforward historical context, but just two things at the end. First, are you courageously and confidently professing your relationship to Jesus? You know, Peter found himself in a tough spot. All of a sudden he's around a bunch of folks that aren't friendlies, to use the military term. They're not friendlies. Hey, you're not one of those, are you too? I don't know the guy. It wasn't so much a moment when Peter's faith failed, but his courage failed. And are we being confident and courageous that we stand for Jesus at a time when it may cost you, even right here in our country? And finally this, are you recognizing he makes clear that the truth you ultimately need comes through him alone? You know, if you happen to stumble onto this tonight, or you're stumbling on from this 65 years from now because YouTube is still archived on the internet, and you're not somebody who's even looked at Jesus in any way yet, do yourself a favor for you. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to anybody else who you're finding 65 years from now. Go look at Jesus for yourself, because he leaves us with some decisions to make, because he says, no, the truth is me. And that's something different. So I pray you may take a look at both of those. Think about those as we're wrapping up. It's about 7:31, and that is John chapter 18. So if you're joining us live tonight, good to have you with us once again. Hope you're enjoying this beautiful night, getting outside a little bit. And if you're joining us at some other point, that's great. I just want to remind you that next week we are going to be off. There will be no Bible study next Wednesday, simply because we are going to be taking a vacation as a family. So we'll be away during this upcoming week, but the next week we'll pick up. And as you can probably tell by now, in July, we'll wrap up the Gospel of John. And then August, we'll shut it down for August. Then come September, we'll have something back up and ready to go again. But thank you if you're continuing to hang in for a year now that we've been looking at the Gospel of John. Amazing how long you can go when you really dive into God's Word. Kind of never has an end to it in terms of what you can find. But